Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
These giants denied the existence of a great spirit. So he caused a great rainstorm to come, and the waters kept rising higher and higher, so that it drove these proud and conceited giants from the low ground to the hills, and thence to the mountains. But at last even the mountain tops were submerged, and then those mammoth men were all drowned. After the flood had subsided, the Great Spirit came to the conclusion that he had made man too large and powerful, and that he would therefore correct the mistake by creating a race of men of smaller size and less strength. This is the reason, say the Indians, that modern men are small and not like the giants of old. They claim that this story is a matter of Indian history, which has been handed down among them from time immemorial. Welcome, friends. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio. And as always, I'm honored to have your attention, and I thank you, listeners from America and all over the world, for taking the time to join me in fellowship and to listen to those things which I will be speaking on this evening and tomorrow. Tonight, I am covering the presence of giants here upon the earth before and after the flood, as it says in Genesis 6, that there were giants on the earth before and after the flood of Noah's day. But specifically, I will be relating of what are contemporary stories. And when I say contemporary, I mean going back just a few hundred years with regard to these particular beings and even their presence in our generation in different parts of the world. And that what we see as in scripture, the relation of the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and the fulfillment of the Genesis 3:15 prophecy of the seed of the woman crushing the head of the seed of the serpent as it nipped at its heel, that this was fulfilled during the time that Christ was crucified on the cross, in that 1,000 years or so earlier, David, the shepherd boy who stood up by the Most High, took on Goliath, the Philistine champion, and stunning him with slingstone, used his own sword to decapitate him. That after taking his head as trophy and delivering it to Jerusalem, where he paraded it before the Israelites to show them that he had indeed mitigated the threat of this Philistine giant and his proud boasting against they and their God, Yahuwah Elohim. And so David then buried it in a place called Golgotha, meaning Goliath of Gath, and that generations and centuries later, when Christ fulfilled the prophecies of coming into the flesh and being virgin born and of the line of Adam's seed from the tribe of Judah, and being born in Bethlehem, that when he was crucified on the hill of the skull, that he in fact fulfilled that prophecy, and that he, as the seed of the woman, was indeed crushing the head, the skull of Goliath, who had been buried there 1,000 years earlier. And so that's how the prophecy was fulfilled. But we see that there is still ongoing conflict between these supernatural beings and that of humanity, and that only makes up a portion of what is in Scripture revealed as the parable of the tares of the field. And that certainly these beings, these men of renown, this six-fingered, six-toed, double-jawed, rows of teeth giants of old, compromise the supernatural aspect of the seed of the serpent. But that, as Daniel said, they shall intermingle themselves among the seed of men, and that the elites who sit on the thrones of the world today, they are part of the Canaanite seed which hides among us in plain sight. And so I wanted to elaborate upon this story, because many now have heard about the reports from special forces and the U.S. military of the Kandahar giant, and how Steve Quayle reported long ago about how one of these ancient giants, which alive even in this generation, was killed in 2002 in Afghanistan, and that two special forces units, the first being slaughtered by this rebel giant, that a second group was sent in, and shocked at what they were witness to, was able to take down this being who was worshipped by the locals as a god and was offered sacrifice and given flesh and blood, being a cannibal. I'm not sure whether it is that they offered their own children, but certainly they made offerings to this individual. And that was the way that they appeased him and kept him from abducting and cannibalizing their villagers. And what is of paramount interest with regard to this story is that I've been reading for the past several months a book called The Solomon Island Mysteries. And in this book, it relates the story of Amarius Boranian, I believe is how you say his name. But he had married a Solomon Islander. He was a white man from Australia who had married into the clan and was accepted. And she, being the chief's daughter, he became privy to a lot of the ancestral knowledge and the stories of the Solomon Islanders as people and what he learned. And amazing to him and amazing to me and those that have read his book is that the Solomon Islanders have been living side by side with the giants for hundreds of years and have stories even in this day and age of how they have had to deal with and have been fearful of their people being kidnapped and flayed and terrorized by these, well, what are several groups of giants living on the different islands there in that particular region. And the stories that he relates are amazing. They are part of what is the oral tradition of those peoples and the interactions that they have had with these particular beings over centuries. And he even relates and had chance to interview a woman who was abducted by the giants and basically kept like a pet and being repeatedly sexually assaulted by them. And I'm not sure exactly how, but according to the story, this was achievable. And there's even stories of how some of the women being abducted were impregnated by the giants and had half breed children, which is interesting. But nevertheless, she had escaped 5 years after the initial abduction. And returning to her village, she was, very traumatized by what she had gone through, but still coherent enough to be able to relate to the author and to the chief as to what she had undergone and what she had witnessed, that she was kept in a cage and also had seen and lived with them deep underground within the interior of these particular islands. And that not only were giants present there in the Solomon's Islands, but there's also a UFO presence there upon the islands as well, which it's interesting to consider whether, there is some connection, as there seems to be in the ancient times, certainly that the fallen angels were connected to the giants of old, and that it is also related in the stories that these particular giants look much like and are closely or similarly related to what we have um, worldwide come to know as Bigfoot or Yeti, and that they have a incredible stench, which always seems to be like with the Kandahar giant, whether it's because they don't bathe or just because they are of evil. There seems to be a sulfur like stench which is related to evil and the presence of evil. And so, whether that's what it is or they just don't bathe and after 10 years or so, you acquire a tremendous body odor. We don't know, but certainly it is related that a smell of rotting flesh or a skunk-like odor is attributed to the presence of these particular beings. And so, anyways, I wanted to share some of what I had discovered because I find it truly fascinating. And I know that people that are interested in this area of study, that you also will be intrigued by this particular book and this information. And I also want to relate it to some of the other stories, the modern tales of these particular giants, which those that have not begun examining or looking into this particular narrative and how it applies to our generation, that you can find many different confirming witness as to the veracity of the biblical account of giants here in the world, both now and in our ancient past. And so I'll be bringing up some of these stories and relating some of these accounts as we go through the evening. But I initially read from what was the report of Buffalo Bill Cody, and he was relating what he had written into his diary about one time they were having dinner and a Native American that they were having discourse with pulled out the leg bone of one of these, a femur bone of one of these giants, and it was, if I'm correct, according to the story, it was larger than even even they were. And a surgeon at the camp pronounced it to be, a thigh bone, or a bone of what was a giant. And that's when some of the stories, the Native American told him that, long ago, even before the Native Americans had populated and took over the Americas, especially North America, that there were in the area a race of giants, and that they were 3 times larger than normal men, and that they were also cannibals. And so that particular story that I read about the flood and the judgment that was brought upon them, this was something that they had shared with regard to these particular beings. And even, I'll see if I can find it really quickly. Um, Abraham Lincoln, in a speech that he gave a long time ago, spoke about these ancient giants and how it was common knowledge that they had lived all all over the Americas. So let me see if I can find this quote and share it with you. I did publish it in one of my books. I forget exactly which one, but it's intriguing to look upon this, this particular speech, and see that it was such common knowledge that it was even mentioned. And during that time in the 1700s and also the 1800s, when the Americas were being farmed and a lot of land was being leveled, that many of the mounds, which were found all over and all across America, and that are still present, like we have here in Georgia in a place called Etowah, the Etowah Indian Mounds. And there in Ohio and that particular valley, Ohio Valley region, there were hundreds of mound structures found, some of the biggest in the world. And there were reports all throughout the different newspapers during those times of bones of giants being found all over the America, some, you know, up to 24 and 30 feet tall. And intriguingly, some of these skeletons of the giants were said even to have horns, which is very interesting. There was a set of giants found in Pennsylvania that had these horny prominences coming out from their skulls. And so, very interesting the history of these particular beings. All right, let me see if I can find this really quickly. Okay, it's at the end of his speech. He says, but still there is more. It calls up, and he's speaking about Niagara Falls at this time, because I believe he was dedicating it as a park or something of that nature. But still there is more. It calls up the indefinite past when Columbus first sought this continent, when Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led Israel through the Red Sea. Nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his Maker. Then, as now, Niagara was roaring here. The eyes of that species of extinct giants whose bones fill the mountains of America have gazed on Niagara as ours do now. Contemporary with the whole race of men and older than the first man, Niagara is strong and fresh today as 10,000 years ago. The mammoth and mastodon, now so long dead that fragments of their monstrous bones alone testify that they ever lived, have gazed on Niagara. In that long, long time, never still for a single moment, never dried, never froze, never slept, never rested. And so you see here, he's speaking about, these giants of old and how they also were witness to the majesty of Niagara in the same manner as we are during his time and even now in our lifetime. And so that's an intriguing aspect of the tale, to say the least. And so, which, you know, Abraham Lincoln had mentioned here that Columbus, when he came to America, that, and also the other conquistadors, when they came here to both North and South America, that they encountered this extinct race of beings. And that stories of them living here in America up to even the late 1800s have been passed down through the native peoples that were contending with them in the different parts of America. And that what the Solomon Islanders are going through even now, though there's an interesting tale of why the giants are no longer cannibalizing which I'll relate that story here shortly, but there's an interesting tale of I believe his name is Liudi Makoti, the name of a giant who is believed to be the chief of this particular Solomon Island group, the Eastern Giants, and how, because of his what became and developed a relationship with the islanders, the native populations, that he actually, his father being chief, that they stopped the cannibalizing of and abduction of the human populations there on Solomon Islands, which I'll go into that story here in just a short bit, but I do want to relate some of the tales of the conquistadors and what they had discovered here in America and even in South America. Even the word Patagonia means big foot, and that many of the conquistadors, when they came through, they discovered and encountered giants, and that these particular giants, um, even though they were not a distinct, during these times, a distinct race of their own, they were the elders and the chiefs of many of these Native American tribes. And that you see that whereas they were warring against the Native Americans in ancient times, they now were the elder chiefs of many of these tribes during the time when the conquistadors came in. And they spoke about it as such. All right, so I'll read of some of these tales. Around 30 men survived the sinking of the raft, but Navarez, this is a particular individual who related from his diaries, going back to 1500s, the stories of what they had encountered after they had crashed off of the shore of what is modern day Tampa. Cabeza de Vaca and the remaining Spanish survivors washed ashore near modern day Tampa Bay. They quickly formed an expedition to reach a Spanish settlement in Mexico and regroup there. Thinking it was only a few miles away, but after a series of battles with hostile natives, they ended up rafting their way into southwestern Texas. Traveling west along the Colorado River, De Vaca and the survivors of the ill-fated expedition became the first Europeans to see a bison or an American buffalo. De Vaca returned to Spain 9 years later and published his story. It was the bestseller of its time. In it, there are references to conquistador encounters with giants. De Vaca's astounding tales mention an encounter with giant natives during a raid while in Florida. When we attempted to cross the large lake, we came under heavy attack from many giant Indians concealed behind trees. Some of our men were wounded in this conflict, for which the good armor they wore did not avail. The Indians we had so far seen are all archers. They go naked, are large of body, and appear at a distance like giants. They are of admirable proportions, very spare, and of great activity and strength. The bows they use are as thick as the arm of 11 or 12 palms in length. which they discharge at 200 paces with so great precision that they miss nothing. In 1539, Hernando de Soto followed in Narvaez's footsteps, sailing 9 ships into Tampa Bay. And as they ventured inland, they encountered various tribes, each with a giant that reigned as chief. For protection, the conquistadors took these chiefs hostage and called them guests. When the natives realized becoming guests meant being turned into slaves, the local tribes, led by Chief Copafi of the Appalachee, sparked an uprising. After weeks of warfare, the chief was finally captured in a battle near what would become Tallahassee. Copafi was described as a man of monstrous proportion. Hernando de Soto's encounters with giants continued as he pushed further inland. In 1539, traveling with more than 600 men and 200 horses, he trekked through North Florida, the southern swamps of Georgia, and the landlocked crossroads of western Alabama before dying of fever near the western banks of the Mississippi. Rodrigo Rangel, De Soto's private secretary, wrote a diary detailing the expedition. The new lands they explored were ruled by the giant Native American chief Tuscaloosa, and upon the conquistadors' arrival, the chief's son fiercely approached De Soto's cavalry. Rangel writes, "Seeing him, we paused, dumb with amazement, for though but a youth, he towered on high, a great-limbed giant. Heads of tallest men reached only to his breast. After a 3-day march, De Soto and 15 soldiers entered Tuscaloosa's village and discovered that the chief was a giant 10 times mightier than his son, and turned out to be the tallest and most handsomely shaped Indian they saw during all their travels. After a few days of watching colorful war dances, Tuscaloosa was persuaded to join De Soto on their quest towards Mobile. While on the trail, 2 of De Soto's soldiers turned up missing, and the returning scouts returned to warn De Soto about the many Native Americans that had gathered for rebellion. De Soto, brave and defiant, approached the town and its high walls. A welcoming committee of painted warriors clad in robes of skin and headpieces with vibrantly colored feathers came out to greet them. A group of young Native American maidens followed, dancing and singing to music played on crude instruments. De Soto entered the town with his most trusted soldiers, Tuscaloosa and the chief's entourage. The Spaniards stood in a piazza surrounded by a stream of foreign colors and fluttering sounds. From here, De Soto saw some 80 houses within the village. Several of them were described as large enough to hold at least 1,000 people. Unknown to De Soto, more than 2,000 Native American warriors stood in concealment behind the walls. After some of the chiefs from the town joined him, Tuscaloosa withdrew into the village, warning De Soto with a severe look to leave at once. Under a hail of arrows, De Soto and most of his men retreated from the village. After regrouping and devising their strategy, the Spaniards gained entry to the village, killed the chief's giant son, and set fire to the buildings and massacred the city's inhabitants. Despite the death of his son and overall carnage left in the wake, Tuscaloosa escaped, riding deep into unknown lands. De Soto and his men marched to capture him, but the giant chief disappeared, and the pursuing Spaniards found only abandoned cities with massive mounds. Just a little bit more, just to give you an idea, and then we'll move on in story. In 1519, Alonso Alvarez de Pineda mapped the lands along the Gulf Coast strategically, marking the various rivers and bays, noticeable landmarks, and porting areas, all of which belonged to the King of Spain. After covering the coastline from Florida to as far as Tampico, Mexico, Pinata sailed back to the mouth of the Mississippi River. Pinata was the first Spanish explorer to venture up the mighty Mississippi, and he reports finding a large settlement of native villages inhabited by giants. After the giants proved to be friendly, Pinata and crew settled among them to rest and make repairs. Pineta detailed the abundance of gold found in the river and how the natives wore plenty of gold engraved ornaments. It's amazing how Pineta was more interested in the lands, good food, and the shock of discovering giants than he was in gold. He also noted that other than giants, the tribes also had a race of tiny pygmies as well. Pineta described the tribe that settled near the Mississippi River as a race of giants from 10 to 11 palms in height. As he sailed back to his home base in Jamaica, he made note of more giants like the famed gargantuans of the Karankawas encountered on the various islands off the Texas coast. When Pineda returned, he presented Francisco de Garay, the Spanish governor of Jamaica, with the first maps and sketches of the entire Gulf Coast. These maps also included Pineda's writing about the fantastic race of giants living there. These sketches and writings are known as Gary's Cedula, Garay's Cedula, and were archived by the famous Spanish compiler Martin Ferdinand de Navarrete. They can be found today by visiting the Archive General de Indias in Seville, Spain. I'll end with this story. I don't want to read too much, but just to give you an idea. There's so much. I mean, I could spend 2 hours just reading all the narratives of the conquistadors and the giants that they encountered here in the Americas. 20 years after Pineda mapped the Gulf, Francisco Coronado marched with a huge expedition across the American Southwest, searching for the legendary seven cities of Cibola, or what we've referred to today as El Dorado. While on their quest, Coronado's expedition crossed paths with several tribes of Indian giants. We have this information thanks to the writings of Pedro de Castaneda, who accompanied Coronado and wrote the complete and amazing history of the expedition. A fascinating tale concerning giants found in Castaneda's book details the journey made by Hernando del Alacran. Low on provisions, a frantic Coronado sent Alacran to find a river that could bring supplies more easily to the Spanish outposts along the California and Mexican coasts. After destroying his ships and missing the waiting party at the rendezvous point, Alacran haphazardly floated up the mouth of the murky Colorado River. Alacran and his men became the first Europeans to fight the rough rapids as he brought his fleet into the heart of the Colorado River, reaching as far as the lower reaches of the Grand Canyon. While coasting up the river, Alacran and his men came upon a settlement of an estimated 200 giant warriors. These giants, amazed by foreign intruders on the riverbanks, were ready to attack, but Alacran diffused the situation by making peace and offering gifts, which eventually won them over. These giants were later categorized with the prevailing tribes of the area as being the Cocopah Indians. 1,000 more members of this giant tribe were discovered and reported farther upstream. Discoveries of giants have also been reported in Mexico. The Dominican friar Diego Duran is responsible for writing some of the earliest Western books on the history and culture of the Aztecs. His family moved from Spain to Mexico City when he was very young, which allowed him to grow up around the remaining natives of Mexico. And while attending school, he was frequently exposed to Aztec culture. Then, under the colonial rule of Spain, he continued to study and travel within the remaining city states of the Aztec Empire. In Texaco, he learned to speak and read the native Nahuatl Aztec language. By winning the Aztecs' trust, he was able to gain access to a vast amount of knowledge concerning the history of pre Columbian Mexico. His writings are some of the oldest known surviving texts that give us actual first hand narratives from the ancient Aztecs. Because he spent 32 years among the Aztecs gathering information, learning how to read ancient native hieroglyphics, and interviewing old shamans, scholars regard Duran's work as extremely important. In the history of the Indies of New Spain, he exhaustively describes the history of Mexico from its mysterious ancient origins up to conquest and occupation by the Spaniards. In these writings, the Aztecs were not shy when it came to talking about giants. But Duran didn't need to hear or read about them, he could see them. While living in Mexico, he came in contact with giant Indians on several occasions. Writing about these encounters, he says emphatically, "It cannot be denied that there have been giants in this country. I can affirm this as an eyewitness, for I have met men of monstrous stature here. I believe that there are many in Mexico who will remember, as I do, a giant Indian who appeared in a procession of the feast of Corpus Christi. He appeared dressed in yellow silk and a halberd at his shoulder and a helmet on his head, and he was all of 3 feet taller than the others." During his 32 years among the Aztecs, Duran also interviewed many old Indians knowledgeable in the ancient ways and traditions of their people. From all these sources, he learned about the giants. Fernando de Sahagun and Joseph de Acosta, two other notable historians of about the same period, also knew about a tribe of giants who once occupied central Mexico. But Duran's book offers us the best and most complete account. Duran writes that according to the Aztecs, the giants and a bestial people of average size once had this land all to themselves. And then in AD 902, 6 tribes of people from Teotihuacan, which is found toward the north and near the region of La Florida, began arriving in Mexico. They soon took possession of the country. These 6 kindred tribes include the Xoximilca, the Chalca, the Tempanic, the Colhua, the Tlahuica, and the Tlaxcalans. A 7th tribe, the Aztecs, were brothers to these people, but they came to live here 301 years after the arrival of the others. Last portion here. When these 6 tribes had settled, Duran continues, they recorded in their painted books the type of land and kind of people they found here. These books show 2 types of people, one from the west of the snow-covered mountains towards Mexico and the other on the east, where Puebla and Cholula are found. Those from the first region were Chichimex, and the people from Puebla and Chola were the giants, the Quiname, which means men of great stature. The few Chichimex on the side of Mexico were brutal, savage men, and they were called Chichimex because they were hunters. They lived among the peaks and in the harshest places of the mountains. where they led a bestial existence. They had no human organization but hunted food like the beasts of the same mountain and went stark naked without any covering on their private parts. When the new nations came, these savage people showed no resistance or anger, but rather awe. They fled towards the hills, hiding themselves there. The newly arrived people, seeing then that the land was left unoccupied, chose at will the best places to live in. The other people who were found in Tlaxcala and Cholu and Huatzicana are said to have been giants. These were enraged at the coming of the invaders and tried to defend their lands. I do not have a very true account of this, and therefore will not attempt to tell the story that the natives told me, even though it was long and worth hearing. The battles that the Choluic fought with the giants until they killed them or drove them from the country. These giants lived no less bestially than the Chichimecs, as they had abominable customs and ate raw meat from the hunt. In certain places of that region, enormous bones of the giants have been found, which I myself have seen dug up at the foot of cliffs. Many times these giants flung themselves from precipices while fleeing from the Cholotecs and were killed. The Cholotecs have been extremely cruel to the giants, harassing them, pursuing them from hill to hill, from valley to valley, until they were destroyed. Even if we detain the reader a little, I should like to tell the manner in which the people of Cholowa and Talaxa annihilated that evil nation. This was done by treason and deceit. They pretended to want peace with the giants, and after having assured them of their goodwill, they invited them to a great banquet. An ambush was then prepared. Some men slyly robbed the guests of their shields, clubs, and swords, and the Cholotecs then appeared and attacked. The giants tried to defend themselves, and as they could not find their weapons, it is said they tore branches from the trees with the same ease as one cuts a turnip, and in this way defended themselves valiantly, but finally were killed. All right, I'm going to stop there. There is much, much more, and I'll actually put a link in the chat, so if you'd like to read it for yourself, you can do so. Because I know we're going to quickly run out of time. And I was talking about the Solomon Island giants and how there's a story of a Lute, I forget his last name. But anyways, I'll tell the tale of how the giants came to befriend the Solomon Island coastal people and how they even went to war against their own kind in order to stop the general edict of their cannibalizing and abducting these human people. And so, what happened, according to the story, is that, well, I'll tell two stories. One was a story of an old man that had heard some screaming. And when he went to go investigate, he found a giant of massive size and proportion that had been wounded by the crocodiles, so the saltwater crocodiles, which are found everywhere in the Solomon Islands, and which, being prevalent, attack and kill. humans almost a death monthly, as reported in this particular book. But anyways, he discovered a giant that was bleeding and wounded and terribly injured, and he tended the wounds of this individual, and then went back to his tribe and asked for the help from his family and other members of his community to bring back the giant so that he could then tend his wounds and heal him, of which the people were opposed to and wanted to just kill the giant and end his life, so because they were cannibals. And so anyways, what happened is he did bring him to his house, placed him on his balcony, tended his wounds, stopped the healing, and was able to heal the giant. And then once the giant came to and regained his senses, he asked the individual why he had saved his life. And he felt a deep sense of gratification. I'm not sure if we're at break, but I'll stop in 1 minute here. But anyway, so after the giants came to his senses, he asked the old man to accompany him to his village and to assist him to get there. And the old man did so. And when he went there, he was introduced to the community. And the giants then promised to come to his aid and to the aid of his people. And they also promised that they would never cannibalize them when the other tribes were still jeopardized because they did not have such relationship. All right, we'll be right back for second hour.
Listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
All right, I do believe we are live again. And so I just want to thank all of you again for taking the time to join me. Zen Garcia, I'm your host. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio, and I am covering the men of renown, the giants of old, and the contemporary sightings of them, even in this day and age. And so I was specifically citing some stories that I had read from a book called The Solomon Island Mysteries, and it's by Marius Boyranian. Very interesting book. I do recommend it for reading by anybody that is interested in this particular study on the giants and what the Bible reveals of this interesting, seemingly otherworldly race of beings that have always been here upon the earth with humanity. And one of the reasons why knowledge of the giants is little found and largely suppressed when there is remnants, stories, and skeletal remains of them all throughout the world, is because they do not fit into the narrative of Darwinian evolution, which, for whatever reason, is the ideology and mindset which the elites of this world want humanity to buy into and to accept without challenge. And because of that, this knowledge and what the Smithsonian Museum and others that like it have been for hundreds of years given the bodies and the remnants of these particular beings as discovered from people all over the country, and that they have suppressed, disappeared, and hidden this information for a very long time and continue to do so. And so, anyways, the story that I was speaking about the old man that accompanied the giant and went back to his homeland, in which they lived deep into the mountains. And what you find on the Solomon Islands is that the giants live in the interiors of the islands, in the deep cave systems, and it's the coastal humans. They live on the outskirts, being fearful of trending inward. They always, in utilizing the sea as escape, they have their villages aligned up and down the coasts. And that is also for purposes of fishing and utilizing the bounty of the sea for their easier survival. And so that's part of what they do. And so, anyways, this old man, once he was went there to the village, this giant village, they accepted him and they showed their appreciation. And this giant that he had saved, he was very beloved. And so all of the people of that clan, they made promises and gave assurances to the old man and to his people that they would not be targeted for cannibalism, and they would be even protected should a skirmish break out. And indeed, the giants were good to their word, because it speaks about in further discourse um, that there was a time when the man, the old man, was way up in a tree and he was garnering beetle nuts, and a giant had come upon him, and he knew that he was going to be consumed, that he was going to be cannibalized. And the giant told him that he recognized him and that he knew that he had the protection of his clan. And so he just asked him to, cut off a branch of beetle nuts for him, and then he went on his way. Which, some of these tales are interesting because it shows almost the gentler, kinder side of what all of us have only considered to be evil, cannibalistic beings. And there's in some of the Solomon Islands, even though that's what they dealt with and contended with for hundreds and even thousands of years, the story of Leuti Makati, which I'll go into now, that he was part of a giant clan that lived on the eastern side of the Solomon Islands, and his grandmother had long ago, when one of her sons had cannibalized a human, found a tobacco smoking pipe and had given it to her as gift. And she, discovering its use, took up a fondness to smoking tobacco. And one day she accidentally had stepped upon her pipe, and crushing it, was devastated to the point where she became depressed, according to the story. And so the giants, knowing that they had received, actually took as bounty from the man that they had cannibalized, this particular pipe, knew that he was a white man, that he had come on a tall sailing ship, and that the only way they could get another pipe was to try to gain one somehow by approaching the men that would often come on these particular ships to take the coastal islanders off to the Australian mainland to work in what was, these kind of plantation settings. And Laute was her grandson. He was still young, and he was smallest amongst the giants. And so he could pass for being human. And so they devised a plan to send him to meet with these particular shipmen and to try to garner a smoking pipe for grandma. And so he dressed up. He even cut his fur, because again um, they were hairy type of giants. And he went down when they saw a sailing ship. He went down to meet with these particular people to see if he could find a smoking pipe for his grandmother. And he was led onto the boat, and he was looking for this pipe when he and some of the other islanders were basically caged, captured, and they were going to be sold off as slave labor on the Australian mainland. And so that's what happened to him. And for a number of years, he was taken to Queensland, and there he was sold off, and nobody wanted to buy him because it says in the story that he had a very ugly and smelly disposition. And there was one old farmer, very poor, which purchased him, and nobody else bid. And so he took him home, and he and his wife, not having children, they basically took him in almost as like their son. And being a giant, he had the strength of 3, 4 men, and so was very capable, and assisted them in raising their crops and doing the chores that he was assigned by them. And they succeeded over a number of years. And this old farmer had a friend that had a sugar plantation which was close, and he would go over to visit, and he wanted Lauti to visit with the other Solomon Islanders, but the Solomon Islanders, recognizing him as a giant and realizing that the giants were cannibals, they ran from him, and the farmers did not understand why. And it was only after um, speaking with one of the native islanders that they discovered this story. So, anyways, after several years of going and visiting, Lauti finally began to befriend some of the other normal human Solomon Islanders, and they spoke a similar dialect, and so the giants and the regular native peoples were able to communicate with one another. And so Lauti discovered that they were very kind people, and they, befriending him, were trying to help him. And learning the story of why he had even come and how he was trying to secure tobacco pipes for his grandmother, one of these Solomon Islanders was able to relate that story to the farmer, because after several years, Lauti had become depressed and his work was slacking off and nobody could figure out why. And then he discovered, in speaking to this other islander at the sugar plantation, that Lauti was homesick, and that he, basically wanted to return, but that he had come to secure tobacco pipes. And so at least the islander was able to relate to the farmer that Lauti, rather than working for wage, wanted to work for tobacco pipes. And so the farmer started paying him in these tobacco pipes, and he accumulated a number of them. Well, there came a time when a carnival came into town, and there were professional boxers which challenged any of the anybody to enter the ring with them, and then they would place their bets and uh, allow people to wage and to bet on the different fighters, and if anybody could last certain rounds or whatever, they would win a certain portion of money. And so this farmer, realizing that Lauti wanted to return home, he, in understanding that he had the strength of 3 men, he was willing to wager all the money that he had garnered with the assistance of Lauti at that time, and he was going to bet and place a bet that he would defeat one of these professional boxers. And Lauti, not understanding what was going on, he went with the farmer into town, because he had never come into town before in this manner. And he hung out while the farmer went inside and found out about where the boxing matches was going to take place, and whether he could actually get Lauti entered in and allowed to fight with uh, one of these professional pugilists. And he was able to speak with the promoter, and all of the people were laughing because these were professional boxers, and Lauti was just a slave, what they called a kanaka, and they were very racial during that time, and so they were all laughing at the farmer and all just lauding insults upon them. And Laute didn't understand what was going on, but the farmer was trying to explain to him that he was going to have him in a boxing match. And he was able to secure the fight and also to place his bets. And everybody was giving high odds to what was a professional German boxer. And they entered into the ring, and the boxer sucker punched Laute in his back and then in his jaw when he turned around. And this made the giant very angry. So much so that when he punched the German boxer, his fist went into his chest and basically ended his life. And because they were, under a boxing match and it was sanctioned, Laute was not charged for the murder of this particular individual. And the farmer was paid out in his bets, and he made an extraordinary amount of money. And Laute didn't know, but he had promised to set him free and also to pay for his passage back to the Solomon Islands so that he could return to his family. And the one individual at the sugar plantation, the farmer went there and also secured his release so that he could accompany Laute back to the Solomon Islands. And they were, at this time, really good friends. And so he did join Laute, and both of them returned back to the Solomon Islands. And Laute, when he returned with 100 plus tobacco pipes. And then when he got home, he ran back to his village. He was missing for a number of years and thought to be dead. And his father was the chief of the eastern clan of giants that lived in the interior of the land. And he empathized with Laute, and Laute told him about he had befriended the islanders and that he realized of how he empathized with them and realized that they were not just, like the pigs that they slaughtered for meat, that they had feelings and emotions and that they were very tender-hearted individuals once he got to know them. And so he explained this to his father, and his father instituted a ban, a prohibition on the kidnapping and also the cannibalization of the coastal island people. And then a faction of the giants, refusing to accept this edict, went to war against the other giants and kidnapped 20 people from one of the coastal towns. And Laute and his people went in and slaughtered many of these other giant clan and secured the release of these 20 individuals which had been abducted, and released them and set them free and promised that they would never ever cannibalize them again. And it was sometime in this generation, because now it is said that Laute is the chief of these giant people, and they no longer have to worry about, for the first time, being cannibalized by the giants. And now they no longer have the fear that they had previously of being abducted and, flayed or skinned alive. And so, all of this is very interesting. And And also, there's stories too of old giants that, being harmless, um, were even given food by the coastal islanders. And so it's all a very interesting and very complicated relationship. But it seems now that the cannibalization, which they had been fearful of for so many hundreds, if not thousands of years, has been dissipated, all because of this, according to the stories of this relationship that Laute had with these other coastal islanders, and being taken slave, and mistreated by the Australian white men. He realized that who, according to him, was the true enemy to he and even the coastal islander people. And so, but anyways, very interesting story. And so I've always only read about the sadistic and evil nature of the particular giants, except in a story called The Smoky God, where these Nordic islanders, these Nordic fishermen, speak about having made it and sailed into the interior of the earth at the northern polar opening, and that they encountered in the interior of the earth a race of giants that was benevolent and friendly. And I always thought that to be strange until reading these particular stories. And so who's to know? I mean, there are other stories in some of the Native American mythologies of there being friendly giants, but of course there are, outnumbering those tales, the stories of the giants which did cannibalize and prey upon the people, the Native Americans people, all across America. And so, anyways, truly interesting story. I do want to relate now another tale about the stories of the giants from the perspective of the Paiute Indians. And this has to do, and has also been confirmed, by some individuals that digging out the bat guano of a cave in Nevada, the Lovelock Cave, they discovered the skeletons of hundreds of giants. And there is a Paiute Indian, a princess, that wrote a book, and in it she spoke about how her people had been at war with a race of cannibal giants, and that they finally had to push these giants back until they all were gathered in a cave, and then they built a large bonfire in front of that cave and smoked them out and basically asphyxiated them to death, and they all died in that cave. And according to the story, these particular individuals later, in excavating this bat guano, they found hundreds of skeletons from these particular beings, and they were all said to be of very much larger stature. And they had with them the items which they utilized in their hunts and in making war and in preparing their food, and that they had lived for generations in that cave. And so I'll read the story of these particular beings to kind of familiarize you with even how the native peoples here in this country had also waged war against these red haired giants, which, for those that don't know the story of the Kandahar giant, which our special forces had killed in Afghanistan, they describe him also as a red haired giant, and that he too was a cannibal. Which, if you don't know that story that I'm talking about, you should definitely look it up. And there are multiple testimonies of special forces and even the pilots that flew the giant out of Afghanistan and that delivered their bodies to certain different bases. That all of this has been affirmed, and you can find more about this particular tale in L.A. Marzulli's The Watcher's 10 video, where he speaks about and describes this entire story in great detail. All right, but anyways, continuing with the Paiute Indian tale of the cannibal red-haired giants. Many Native American tribes from the Northeast and Southwest still relate the legends of the red-haired giants and how their ancestors fought terrible, protracted wars against the giants when they first encountered them in North America almost 15,000 years ago. Others, like the Aztecs and Mayans, recorded their encounters with the race of giants to the north when they ventured out on exploratory expeditions. Who were these red-haired giants that history books have ignored? Their burial sites and remains have been discovered on almost every continent. In the United States, they have been unearthed in Virginia, New York State, Michigan, Illinois, Tennessee, Arizona, and Nevada. And it's the state of Nevada that the story of the native Paiute wars against the giant red-haired men transformed from a local myth to a scientific reality during 1924 when the Lovelock Caves were excavated. At one time, the Lovelock Cave was known as Horseshoe Cave because of its U-shaped interior. The cavern, located about 20 miles south of modern-day Lovelock, Nevada, is approximately 40 feet deep and 60 feet wide. It's a very old cave that predates humans on this continent. In prehistoric times, it lay underneath a giant inland lake called Lahontan that covered much of western Nevada. Geologists have determined the cavern was formed by the lake's currents and wave action. The Paiutes, a Native American tribe indigenous to parts of Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, told early white settlers about their ancestors' battles with a ferocious race of white, red-haired giants. According to the Paiutes, the giants were already living in the area. The Paiutes named the giants Saiteka, that literally means tool eaters. The tool is a fibrous water plant the giants wove into rafts to escape the Paiutes' continuous attacks. They used the rafts to navigate across what remained of Lake Lahontan. According to the Paiutes, the red-haired giants stood as tall as 12 feet and were a vicious, unapproachable people that killed and ate captured Paiutes as food. The Paiutes told the early settlers that after many years of warfare, all the tribes in the area finally joined together to rid themselves of the giants. One day, as they chased down the few remaining red-haired enemy, the fleeing giants took refuge in a cave. The tribal warriors demanded their enemy come out and fight. The giants steadfastly refused to leave their sanctuary. Frustrating at not defeating their enemy with honor, the tribal chiefs had warriors fill the entrance to the cavern with brush and then set it on fire in a bid to force the giants out of the cave. The few that did emerge were instantly slain with volleys of arrows. The giants that remained inside the cavern were asphyxiated. Later, an earthquake rocked the region, and the cave entrance collapsed, leaving only enough room for bats to enter it and make it their home. Thousands of years later, the cave was rediscovered and found to be loaded with bat guano, almost 6 feet deep. Decaying bat guano becomes saltpeter, the chief ingredient of gunpowder, and was very valuable. Therefore, in 1911, a company was created specifically to mine the guano. As the mining operation progressed, skeletons and fossils were found. The guano was mined for almost 13 years before archaeologists were notified about the findings. Unfortunately, by then, many of the artifacts had been accidentally destroyed or simply discarded. Nevertheless, what the scientific researchers did recover was staggering. Over 10,000 artifacts went unearthed, including the mummified remains of two red-haired giants, one a female 6.5 feet tall, the other male over 8 feet tall. Many of the artifacts, but not the giants, can be viewed at the small Natural History Museum located in Winnemucca, Nevada. As the excavation of the cave progressed, the archaeologists came to the inescapable conclusion that the Paiutes myth was no myth, but true. What led them to this realization was the discovery of many broken arrows that had been shot into the cave and a dark layer of burned material under sections of the overlaying guano. Among the thousands of artifacts recovered from this site of an unknown people is what some scientists are convinced is a calendar, a donut shaped stone with exactly 365 notches carved along its outside rim and 52 corresponding notches along the inside. But that was not to be the final chapter of the red-haired giants in Nevada. In February and June of 1931, two very large skeletons were found in the Humboldt dry lake bed near Lovelock. One of the skeletons measured 8.5 feet tall and was later described as having been wrapped in a gun-covered fabric similar to Egyptian mummies. The other was nearly 10 feet long. This was all published in the Nevada Review Minor newspaper, June 19th, 1931. And so you can see that what we have regarded as mythology, the Native American lores, the stories of the wars of these native peoples with these particular giants, that these stories are related in the oral traditions of peoples all over the world, and that what is related in the Bible of the sons of God mating with the daughters of Cain and of humanity, that these particular tales are truthful, and that the fallen angels did mix with initially the pre-Adamites, and that these giant beings have been part of the historical record for thousands of years, and that they were even here before the coming of modern humanity. That you'll notice in the Genesis 6, in that particular quotation, it says that, let me actually bring it up, just so I can read it correctly. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. In the story of the account of the creation of humanity, first the pre-Adamites in Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28, we see that it is related in the scriptures that it was during the creation of the pre-Adamic peoples that they were created male and female, created in couples and in multiple races. And that it was these particular beings that created on the earth were told to multiply and replenish the earth. And so, in my reading of the passage here in Genesis 6, it becomes clear to me that what is being related in the story of the sons of God mating with the daughters of men is not simply the fall of the watchers as related in the book of Enoch, the 200 watchers that left their first estate, their place of habitation, during the time of Enoch's father, Yared, which Yared meaning descent, that it was during this time that the 200 watchers abandoned their first estate. And the story of their having once been holy angels, but then leaving and imploring the Most High God and Yeshua as the Word to allow them to come here to the earth so that they could teach humanity about the place that they had fallen from. Instead, lusted after the daughters of Cain and finding them involved in basically an orgy of massive proportion, they took wives of all which they chose. And as I said, you can find great detail of this story in the Kebra Nagas, Kebra chapter 100, concerning the fall of the angels. And in that story, you'll see how being holy angels and wanting to come down here to the earth, that they challenge Yeshua to put them into bodies of flesh. so that they could leave their celestial abode. And being given bodies of flesh, they were allowed to descend here to the earth, but that they were to remain righteous and to teach humanity about whom to worship in the heavens. But instead of doing so, even after promising Christ that that was their purpose and that was the reason why they wanted to come here and why they challenged him to put them into flesh form, they fell away immediately. And lusting after flesh, they were led astray into carnality. And so we see that the story of the fall of modern humanity through Adam and Eve is also the same story of the fall of the Watchers, the 200 holy angels which, leaving their first estate, were like Adam and Eve, beguiled by carnality and deceived and tempted to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And for that, they also came under the authority of death, in the same manner that Adam and Eve had. And so, anyways, we see that, the stories of the giants and their presence here goes back to even the pre-Adamite people. And that's why we see in the oral traditions of peoples worldwide that they relate the account of the creation of many of these megalithic sites, like Pumapunku and Teotihuacan and Baalbek, places diverse and widely spread across the earth plane, that all of them attribute giants as being responsible for the development of the architecture, which they themselves, the native peoples, deny having created. And so all over the world you find the accounts of giants being specified as being the creators of these particular sites. And why it is, again, in the mythologies, that the native peoples speak about this long race, this extinct race, which isn't as extinct as we think them to be, that they are surviving even now in this day and age, and that there are places in the world where they are found. But what is interesting to me about especially the story of the Kandahar giant is that this particular pilot, when he returned home, he spoke about how he was in Kelly's brew pub, and this Native American came up to him and asked him, well, first sang over him, and then asked him if he knew about the giants. And then he relayed the story of how he had flown one of these beings out of Afghanistan. Well, the Native American told him that the giants were very much real and that they were going to be released at the end of days. Which, for those that are familiar with my work, you know that in my book, Paradise, Sides in the North and the Month of the Congregation, that I speak about how what is cited as the abysmal chasm which is a hollow earth entrance to the abysmal chasm or the bottomless pit, where, according to the Cave of Treasures and the Book of the Bee, it is cited in chapter there, and I bring it out in this book on the hollow earth, how it is that the giants were locked up and were confined into the interiors of the earth, and how it is that at the end of days they will be the Joel chapter 2 army, part of the locust army, the supernatural army which released by the angel of the bottomless pit is allowed to come forth, to emerge upon the world, and to decimate 2/3 of those that are living during that time. Which, in my opinion, those that will be here will be the wicked that are not written into the books of life once the angels go forth to gather the wheat for preservation, and that they are allowed to bring forth the wrath of the Most High God upon the wicked that remain alive during that time. And so, in my opinion, we will see, or at least those that are of the wicked not written into the books of life, in my opinion, they will see the release of the wicked giants. Because in the passage that I'm speaking of from Isaiah chapter 3 and 13, and also the Cave of Treasures in the Book of the Bee, it speaks about these individuals in a manner that they are cannibals and that they even eat the aborted fetuses of women, and that they never bury their dead, but they eat them. And so, very much like the cannibal giants we see related in story in the mythology and the oral traditions of people worldwide. So, if you're interested in what I'm talking about, please do check out The Solomon Island Mysteries by Amarius Borainian. I think you'll find it interesting. And certainly it confirms even the stories of the Paiute Indians and now the Afghani people, and the stories of the conquistadors in their contemporary interactions with these particular beings, and that they are still here with us. As the Bible says, that there were giants in the land before and after. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. All right, God bless all. Good night.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.